Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be looking at body, mind, and death. My guest is David Lorimer, who is the program director of the Scientific and Medical Network. He is the editor of a number of books, including The Spirit of Science: From Experiment to Experience, Thinking Beyond the Brain, a Wider Science of Consciousness, The Circle of Sacred Dance, which is about Peter Deunov's Paneurythmy. He is also the author of many books, including Survival, Death as a Transition, Whole in One, The Near-Death Experience and the Ethic of Interconnectedness, Resonant Mind, Life Review in the Near-Death Experience, and most recently, A Quest for Wisdom, Inspiring Purpose on the Path of Life. David lives in France, and now I'll switch over to the internet interview. Hello, David. It's a real pleasure today to be with you.
And with you, Jeff. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You've been the program director of the Scientific and Medical Network now for over 3 decades, I believe, which means that you've been exposed to the widest range of cutting-edge ideas in science and medicine and in philosophy. Your new book, A Quest for Wisdom, is a real treasure, but I thought it would be a good thing to begin for the benefit of our viewers, many of whom are not familiar with the Scientific and Medical Network, if you said a few words about it.
Yes, sure. Well, I was the actual director of the network between 1986 and 2000, and then I've been program director since then. I managed to hive off the administrative and accounts aspects and concentrate on the creative part, which was rather nice for me. But the Scientific and Medical Network was founded in 1973 by a number of senior people, notably George Blaker, who was a civil servant at the Department for Education and Science and knew Gandhi in India because he had some postings in India. Then there was Dr. Peter Leggett, who was the Vice Chancellor of University of Surrey, a mathematician and aeronautical engineer. Then there was Sir Kelvin Spencer, who had been the chief scientist at the Ministry of Power in the 1950s. And then finally, the medical part was Dr. Patrick Shackleton, who was Dean of Postgraduate Studies at the University of Southampton Medical School. And they were, in fact, brought together by Father Andrew Glazewski, who was a Polish priest who had an interest. He was a sensitive himself, and he had an interest in the sort of higher realities. And what brought these founders together was that they all had mystical experiences, and they knew firsthand that there was more to reality than just the physical. And they were concerned that young scientists and doctors being trained were also being trained into an exclusively materialistic way of thinking. And so they were looking to expand the basis of science and medicine beyond the restrictions of scientific materialism. So that was the original impulse for the founding of the network. And how it happened, which is quite a nice story, is that they had a meeting of about 12 people at Exeter University, chaired by Sir Kelvin Spencer and George Blaker. And then each of them agreed to write a letter to a few selected professional friends to ask whether they'd like to join this network. And it was the first organization to call itself a network, as far as I know. Now it's very common. And the letter was carefully drafted so that they could either ignore it or respond enthusiastically and say, yes, they'd like to be a part of this new initiative. And they got about 50 responses. And so these were the original Scientific and Medical Network members.
And now, how many members do you have today?
Well, it hasn't been a linear progression because we had our maximum number of merely 3,000 about 20 years ago, and we are in a situation where I think a lot of people don't join organizations anymore. I mean, with so much information out there, that people can get all the information they need, and younger people as well have different ways of networking, and so I think all the organizations, membership organizations, are under a little bit of pressure. But we've got about 850, I think, and rising at the moment because we've had a very active program over the last year.
Well, and as I recall, you have also founded a project within the Scientific and Medical Network called the Galileo Commission. Can you explain that?
Yes, that's been going for about 4 years. And the Galileo Commission, the reason it's called the Galileo Commission is with this parallel of Galileo trying to persuade the professor of philosophy, not let alone the cardinals, to look through the telescope at what he had established about the moons of Jupiter. And so we have a parallel situation where a lot of committed materialistic scientists are not prepared to look at any evidence which might contradict that metaphysic. In fact, they don't even recognize it's a metaphysic because they think that science is devoid of metaphysics. It's entirely neutral. And they confuse what is technically called scientism, which is an ideological philosophy or an ideological approach, with the scientific method, which is an open inquiry, open and critical inquiry. And so we got together about 100 prominent people in the field, to back a report written by Professor Harold Wallach, which was published in 2018. And we've got at the moment about 840 people on our mailing list, about 350 professional affiliates as academics and advisors, and then the rest friends, people who are interested. And we've just had our second Galileo Commission Summit, which was very well attended by about 370 people.
I gather, David, that one of the major inspirations for the work that you do comes out of the teachings of Emmanuel Swedenborg, who I think that's now well over 200 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. Swedenborg was an extraordinary man, and he's not very well known in the mainstream at all. He was originally a scientist, engineer. He was offered the chair of mathematics at Uppsala University when he was 27. And so he was no slouch in that department. He wrote a 2-volume book on the brain, about 700 pages, and was one of the first people to identify lateralization of hemisphere function. Peter Fenwick can tell you something about that. And so he was also a politician. He sat in the upper house of the Swedish Parliament, and was credited with a number of inventions. But what happened is that when he was in his mid-50s, suddenly he found his inner senses opening, so that he could see into the invisible worlds. And he started writing about this in very elegant Latin. And what struck me about this, when I first came across it, which was in my final year at university, was how sober all these accounts were. So he would be talking about what most people would regard as extraordinary experiences, but in a very matter-of-fact way. And also there are a number of well-attested incidents which indicate his clairvoyant powers, which were checked out by the philosopher Kant. And Kant actually was satisfied that these experiences really did happen to Swedenborg, but of course he had no way of explaining them. And being an academic, he really didn't want, even in those days, to look through the telescope.
You know, in an earlier interview I did on philosophy and psychical research with a young philosopher, Jason Reza-Georgiani, he pointed out that Kant, in his book, I think it's called Dreams of a Spirit Seer, basically tried to debunk Swedenborg, and yet at the same time it seemed that Kant's philosophy, which sometimes referred to as transcendental idealism, seemed to have been inspired by Swedenborg.
Yes, that's an interesting paradox. I mean, in Dreams of a Spirit Seer, and I actually have an essay about this, which is one of my presidential addresses from the Swedenborg Society, he doesn't even spell Swedenborg's name right. And so it's like a kind of cartoon. And you're right. He owes something of a debt to Swedenborg, but as an academic, he feels that he can't commit himself to the sort of transcendental perspective which Swedenborg was actually experiencing and writing about.
And in your work, particularly in your book, Resonant Mind, and in your new book as well, A Quest for Wisdom, you suggest that we can learn a lot about the afterlife, and in particular the past life review process, by studying the writings of Swedenborg. He seemed to have direct knowledge of these things.
Yes, I would say so. And indeed, he knew when he was going to die. And so in March 1772, he told his landlady that he would be departing for the other world before the end of the month. And that therefore he would pay his rent up until the end of March, and she could advertise the room after that, which is rather a nice story. And then so I think it's about 28th of March, he said his goodbyes and he went upstairs and died. Otherwise left his body. But what he experienced before that was the process of death in order to be able to describe it in his book, Heaven and Hell. And so he's taken through the process by, you might say, his guides or supporters or support system on the other side. And then he describes a process not unlike what's described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where you encounter different levels of the angelic world. And so you start with the celestial angels. And if you can't stand the light, then you move down to the spiritual angels. And if you still can't stand that, then the natural angels. And then you go right the way down, in inverted commas, to the point where you feel comfortable, which corresponds to your own, as it were, vibrational frequency. And that's where you go. In inverted commas. And so the afterlife for Swedenborg is a state of consciousness, which corresponds to what he calls the ruling love. And the ruling love is really your index, if you like, of where you are on a love and wisdom scale. And so the higher you are, the more celestial, if you like.
Now, you use the word you. It suggests that there's really a person there on the other side. And as I recall, Swedenborg suggested you have your memories, you have your sense of self, even without a body, or at least the physical body as we know it. You must have some sort of a body, I presume.
Yes, I think that was his understanding. And of course, this feeds into the whole esoteric tradition and the Hindu tradition of subtle bodies. And you'll find this in more modern researches such as Robert Crickall, when he tries to make a map of the different subtle bodies. And normally one would say astral, mental, causal, etheric. Sorry, etheric would come first. And so you can see Swedenborg's not as precise as that, but you can see that he's in the same ballpark in terms of there being subtle bodies. And also, as you said, that there is really no fundamental change in the individuality immediately following death. I mean, I think there are changes after that, but then, it's hard to know when one's in a three-dimensional form, which is kind of sealed off from the deeper levels of what we're talking about.
Well, one has a sense that Swedenborg, for a period of many years, decades, I think, from his awakening, began to engage in, I think he would have said, daily conversations with people on the other side. And he's written encyclopedic works describing all of this. He founded a religion, and yet I think you would describe him more as a scientist exploring the afterlife than as a religious prophet.
Yes, he probably combined both. I mean, had it existed, he would definitely probably have been president of the Scientific and Medical Network, because he never lost this scientific curiosity and rigor, which he applied to these various different realms. But yes, you're right. He effectively founded a church, the Swedenborg church, although I'm not absolutely clear whether this was something he did in his lifetime. I think it was something that happened afterwards. And indeed, the Swedenborg Society in London was founded in 1810, so not that long after his death, 28 years after his death. And that has an extraordinary archive. And people like one of the most distinguished presidents, interestingly, of the Swedenborg Society was Sir William Barrett, who was also president of the Society for Psychical Research and leading physicist of his day, and senior member, fellow of the Royal Society.
Well, I think in the U.S., a big influence of Swedenborg was upon the father of William James, who's considered the father of American psychology. His father, Henry James Sr., was a lay minister, really, in the Swedenborg tradition and had a huge impact on the American transcendentalist movement.
Yes, that's very interesting. And William James is one of my great intellectual heroes, and he probably is of yours as well, and maybe some of the listeners. And he was obviously steeped in this epistemology and ontology, if you like, of Swedenborg. And so it wouldn't come as something completely surprising to him when he found that other people were describing similar experiences, which of course he documents in detail in his famous Varieties of Religious Experience, his Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh in 1901-2.
William James also, before he died, his last great work was a book called, or a series of essays on radical empiricism. And I'm under the impression that his approach to radical empiricism is to say, yes, let's use the empirical methods of science, but the most direct experience we have is our inner experience. That's even before sensory experience. So we have to include that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I think radical empiricism is a very important principle, because it means you have to take everything into account. And I think that some scientists try to avoid this by kind of bracketing off what they can't explain. And an interesting example of this was Freeman Dyson, because he wrote the foreword, or one of the forewords, to Extraordinary Knowing by Elizabeth Lloyd Meyer, which came out in 2006. And what happened to her was that she, by means of map dowsing, she was able to relocate a harp that her daughter had lost, and by a circuitous route, because it's rather a long story, she recovered the harp and was convinced that she would only have done so with the input of this map dowser. In terms of the sort of psychic faculty, if you like. And so what Dyson said, well, because it didn't happen to me, I don't need to take that into account in my system of reality. And I feel that's a bit disingenuous, but even due to the fact that he wrote this forward in the first place, he was attacked by his fellow scientists for kind of besmirching his ideological purity. So I think that was a very interesting instance. I did know Freeman Dyson a little bit. He was an honorary member of the network, and a very broad-minded scientist and intellectual. And so I think he must have felt a lot of pressure, to distance himself from this. But as Jeff Kripal and also at an earlier stage, Alfred Russel Wallace said, there are no impossible experiences. So if something's impossible, it's not the problem with the experience, it's a problem with your theory.
Well, I should think that the work that you're doing with the Scientific and Medical Network puts you sort of on the front lines of this huge metaphysical battle, I think, that's going on right now between the materialists and I guess you could say, broadly speaking, the post-materialists, people who feel that we can't limit ourselves strictly to material science. After all, it's a metaphysical position. It's not justified by the scientific method.
That's exactly right. And I think the difficulty is that philosophy and history and philosophy of science is not part of what scientists are trained in. It's a specialist discipline. And so they don't know that science actually rests on a philosophy in spite of what Mach and the positivists said. And therefore there's, for instance, just the assumption that unity is desirable or that unity is an important criterion for epistemological or methodological approaches. And Nicholas Maxwell has done a lot of work on this more recently. And he shows that there's a kind of nest of philosophical assumptions, and I think the main one that we're trying to call into question, and know so far as consciousness and neuroscience is concerned, is the assumption that the brain generates consciousness, and therefore, of course, if this is true, there could not be, by definition, any post-mortem existence, any existence of extended mind. And many other phenomena are just impossible in principle. And this is really the position of what Charlie Tart would call the pseudo-skeptics, that they maintain that everything must fit into a naturalistic and physicalist scheme. And that's the big, metaphysical, philosophical endeavor at the moment, is to bring everything into this naturalistic framework. And I don't think this works because consciousness is a quite different phenomenon.
Now, I know you're very concerned with ethics, and I think it's ironic in a way. One of the foremost proponents of this idea that consciousness is a product of the brain was the great philosopher Bertrand Russell. And as I read your book, I see you've written favorably about Russell. He was a social activist. He was on the forefront of ethical thinking, and at the same time, he was leading the resistance against the idea of post-mortem survival.
Yes, he was, but there's an interesting sort of sequel to this. In my book, Survival, the last chapter, I talk about the instances of people who have come back to say they survived. And among these is Bertrand Russell. And this is the irony is not lost on him. Which is part of the amusement, because he says that if he had read the account of what he's trying to convey during his physical lifetime, he wouldn't have believed it. And so he finds himself in this paradoxical situation of having found that his consciousness and mind still existed. Not only that, he said that it was working, his mental faculties were working far better than they were when he died, because his body was very tired. He was 98. And he never really kind of let up. And he was imprisoned in his 90s, for his work in CND. But what he describes though is he says that it's entirely understandable, that he should have thought what he thought while he was still alive. But he now realizes that the physical existence is almost like a dream. But it's quite logical, to think that it's all there is while you're in it. But now he's got another perspective. Then of course he has to reconstruct his understanding of, the physical world and its relationship to consciousness and mind.
You are referring to automatic writing that came through. I forget who the medium was.
Rosemary Brown. She was the one who also composed music, despite having no musical education. So this kind of evidence is really, I call it almost resonant, because what Russell, in inverted commas, says in the text is that maybe some people will be able to tell something typical about him from just the way he speaks and his phrasing. But of course, he realizes that there's no way he can persuade a skeptic like himself that it is actually him speaking and not just something just made up. But I think there are other books, one of which I actually read in manuscript recently, where the sheer intelligence and articulacy of the communications means that you could credit them, to the person who they say they came from. But of course, there's no way of establishing that sort of beyond reasonable doubt.
Well, Rosemary Brown is a very interesting case because, as you point out, she was not highly educated. And to my recollection, she produced hundreds of pieces of music in the style of many of the great composers of the past, in addition to the literary output that you've just referred to. I mean, Bertrand Russell had a very unique personality and style of writing that I think does come through in that passage you quoted.
Yes, well, that was my conclusion. But of course, other people might interpret that passage differently. But on the other hand, almost nobody knows of its existence.
If I recall correctly, David, you are also a musician.
Not really. I mean, I do play a bit of piano, and occasionally I have played the organ. I mean, I'd like to restart actually, but I wouldn't call myself a musician. I love music, particularly the music of Bach. But my interest is less active than actually I'd like it to be. And so you may prompt me into starting to play a bit more.
I'm referring now to your essay on Albert Schweitzer, who was a well-known musician and an organist, and you referred at the time to your own study of the organ and Bach's music. But I should think that gives you enough of a background to be able to evaluate some of the other musical productions of Rosemary Brown.
Yes, I suppose that would be the case, but it's not something I've actually gone into in any detail. I mean, I know about it, but I would have to do a bit more research. I mean, if there's some pieces by Bach, then I would be able to recognize the patterns. Because one of the things I love doing, and I was doing it last year with a Dutch organist called Van Dozelaar, was following the scores while listening to the music, because then you begin to understand the architecture of the way that Bach builds his fugues up, and there's some three passages going up, then it'll level off, and there'll be a corresponding 3 passages coming down, and you begin to understand the way he uses musical language. And one beautiful example is the wedge fugue. This is the E minor fugue. And if you look on the page, it looks like a wedge. And of course you can't hear that necessarily unless you translate the music onto the page. But on the page, it's absolutely clear why it was called the wedge.
Well, I am under the impression, back to Rosemary Brown, that at least one professional musicologist studied her productions in detail and felt that she had indeed been producing works that were contained, I guess you'd say, the musical signature of the original composers to who these were credited.
Yes, I think you're right. And of course, this then poses the question, well, where does this come from? Because and the 2 standard answers would be, well, it's sort of read out of the Akashic record, or the super ESP consciousness soup, or in some way she was inspired by the composer, him or herself. And I think the same applies really, if you're looking at some of the stories about Swedenborg. Did he really speak to the people he claims to have spoken to? And you're up against the same structural issue, and that either things are as he said they were, or you have at least to posit, an extraordinary degree of extrasensory perception, which already is an advance away from a purely materialistic understanding of reality.
Now, I know in the case of Swedenborg, there's good reason to attribute extrasensory perception to him. He, for example, famously at a dinner party in Gothenburg, Sweden, announced that he was aware of a fire going on simultaneously in Stockholm 300 miles away. And this is in the 1700s when they didn't have electronic communication. But that was confirmed. On the other hand, I'm also aware in Swedenborg's writings that he claimed to have discourses with the people who lived on the moon and on Venus. He described them as inhabiting some sort of physical reality, which would seem, from current day knowledge, not to be possible.
Yes, though that's always an interesting issue. Where you have your boggle threshold. And if you start from, his account of talking to people, beings on the moon, then that might give you a reason to dismiss everything else that he did, as equally nonsensical. And so I think it's a difficult one because, we are not him, and we haven't had that experience, and we can't rule it out in principle, even if we would think it's vanishingly improbable and unlikely. But I think what's of more interest to me are some of the conversations he reports with the Lutheran reformers, because he has these debates about, according to his own account, about vicarious atonement, which he didn't believe in. But which Luther and Calvin and Melanchthon did believe in. This is reported in a kind of theological debate, in an extremely articulate manner. And so, you could say, well, that's just, using an imaginary character as a foil. And so beyond a certain point, there's actually no way of knowing. And it becomes a matter of overall trust and integrity.
I know William James once commented on this sort of thing in his language, basically 19th century language, in which he said, when it comes to the conflict between the mystics and the scientifics, he said, the mystics generally have it correct with regard to what they experience, and the scientifics have it correct with regard to the interpretation.
Ah, well, that's interesting. And I know he also felt that it was impossible to get, knock down evidence in the area that would convince everybody. And I think that's still true. There's a sort of element of the trickster, in this field. But of course, your interpretation, coming back to our earlier conversation, depends on the range of explanations that you're prepared to take into account or prepared to countenance. And so if one looks, for instance, at the interpretations of near-death experiences, then most neuroscientists will say, well, it's got to be something that can entirely be explained through normal or unusual neural processes. Whereas the mystic, the person who's experienced that themselves, especially if they have something to report during the period of unconsciousness, will say, no, it was more than that.
I'm under the impression, for example, that amongst the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, including William James, but most of the other great founders of that society, and they're very distinguished people, came to the conclusion personally that they could accept survival of personality or the soul after death, but for the most part, they weren't willing to go so far as to say that it was established as a scientific reality.
Yes, I think that's true. And this is more, in a way, it's more of a philosophical issue than a scientific issue. But again, I mean, my approach to this is to take a kind of legal forensic angle, because what you're trying to do, and supposing you take, for instance, the 1,200 pages of Phantasms of the Living by Gurney, Podmore, and Myers, which was an early publication of the SPR from 1886. Now, if you read that book, which I did a long time ago, then the quality of analysis and intelligence that comes across is very, very clear. I mean, these people were fellows at Trinity College, Cambridge, and they were among the most intelligent and well-read people of their day. And then if you then look at, for instance, let's just take the example of crisis apparitions, which is when someone who's dying appears to someone who knows them closely, but without that second person knowing that the person is dying, and generally only finds out 2 or 3 days later, and then you sort of put the jigsaw puzzle together. And so if you look at what you can do, obviously, is to check up and make sure that you've got the accounts straight, that it wasn't made up, and you check, well, did the person tell other people before they learnt that actually the person had died, and so on. So there are all sorts of procedural and investigative matters that you can look into. But at the end of the day, this is really quite a well-established fact that there are crisis apparitions. And so my argument is that you have to understand or construct an interpretation of reality and the nature of consciousness, which can account in some way for this phenomenon. And so what people say is that, and this is quite widespread across a range of different kind of evidence, is that you can, in your imagination, and when you die and leave your physical body, you can actually go where you think. And if you think yourself into the presence of a loved one, then they will reciprocally see you and sense you. And in some cases, and as an apparition, you will appear and then disappear. And actually, it's only when you disappear, when the person, the percipient sees the person, inverted commas, disappearing, they realize it was an hallucination or an apparition in the first place. And so in this case, the reciprocal cases are maybe some of the most interesting, because you've got two independently or more meshing reports which correspond on the one hand to an apparition, but on the other hand to an out-of-body experience. This is slightly different because the people haven't necessarily died. But for instance, in some cases, the dying person will say the name of the person to whom they are simultaneously appearing.
So witnesses at the deathbed have that observation.
Yes, and this is where putting these different accounts together is obviously crucial for the credibility of this whole field. It's when you get this meshing of different accounts, but the same timing, that these things become particularly significant, I think.
Part of your work, David, as I understand it, is looking at the ethical implications of this research. It's not just the scientific implications. It has something to say about how we live our lives, that we're all interconnected, and that should in some way impact the way we treat each other.
Well, that's really the fundamental thesis of my book, Hole in One, which is now republished as Resonant Mind. And in it, I look at three things, in fact. One is psychometry, this object reading, that it's possible to pick up something about the lives of people just by touching and holding items that are associated with them. And that's what I call empathetic resonance, or it's an example of empathetic resonance. And the second and main phenomenon is a life review, where you experience every aspect of the event or an event in your life. So you don't just experience it from your own original point of view. You experience it from the point of view of everybody who is involved in it. But I mean, taking a simple example, it would just be, let's say, one person. But it can get multi-layered and much more complex than that. And so you realize from that we must be fundamentally interconnected in terms of one universal mind, of which we are microcosms, if you like, or individualizations. Otherwise, such an empathetic resonance in life review couldn't actually happen. And then the third element is the mystical experience, where people experience themselves as the oneness, as the universal mind, as the divine mind itself. And this is a direct experience of what in the Western esoteric tradition would be called gnosis, which has sort of fallen out of favor because our whole culture is based on reason and analysis, which is the left hemisphere. And reason for the Greeks was that a secondary or inferior faculty of knowing, if you like. The superior faculty was what Bonaventure calls the eye of contemplation, and which is the gnosis eye. And I've been trying to think of a new term for describing this, which would as a kind of some equivalent of the telescope, but we haven't quite got there yet.
I think in one of your essays suggests that it's a question of right and left hemisphere, and we live in a left hemisphere dominated culture, whereas a right hemisphere dominated culture might be more appropriate.
This all comes from the seminal work of Ian McGilchrist, who I've known for 40 years. And Ian is a neuropsychiatrist and literary scholar, who's the author of The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which came out in 2009. And it's an extraordinarily brilliant and influential book, because his claim is that our society, Western societies, are dominated by this left hemisphere analytical reductionist thinking, whereas the right hemisphere is the creative, intuitive, and the grasper of the whole. And so his revolutionary claim is the right hemisphere is in fact the master, and the left hemisphere is the emissary. But of course, the left hemisphere thinks it's the master and then dismisses the importance of the right hemisphere. And what he emphasizes, of course, is that these hemispheres have to work together. It's no use having one working without the other. And then all the great sages and philosophers, I know Radhakrishnan, for instance, have said the same. They said we have to combine rational analysis and intuitive insight. And even in science, you couldn't make a scientific discovery, an important scientific discovery, without using your intuitive insight. Einstein is obviously a classic example of that. But then once you have that insight into the whole, which is a direct form of knowing, then you need to work out the mathematics and the analysis in support of it.
So it's really a question that we're all faced with in a way, living in two worlds simultaneously.
Yes, but I think the important implication which I drew out in my final chapter called Towards an Ethic of Interconnectedness is that if at various levels, and you can derive this from symbiosis, from ecosystems, from quantum entanglement, if there is a fundamental wholeness and oneness of which we are partial expressions, then effectively we are each other at a deep level. Which means when we harm someone else, or when we do good to someone else, we're actually doing it to ourselves. And that's the actual realization. That's the fundamental and central realization of the life review. And it's why people come back and their lives are changed, because they realize that it's not a matter of competing and of getting one up on your neighbor or your competitors. We're all in this together. And so we need to be living a life for the whole rather than a life just for our own individual interest.
Isn't that the basic message of the Golden Rule and the teachings of Jesus when he says, what you do to the least among us, you do to me?
Totally. Yes. I mean, I make this point in the book. And of course, there are many different versions and traditions of the Golden Rule. But what I make clear, which is not always clear in the religious formulations, is that this is a logical consequence of the oneness and universality of mind and heart, I should add as well, because in this deep experience that people have, it's never just about light and understanding. It's always also infused with love. And this is a huge contrast to the scientific outer-oriented understanding of the universe, that it is impersonal and unfeeling. So if you look from the inside and deep inside, this is what you arrive at. But if you look just at the outside, then of course we are a very small solar system in this vast galaxy. And as Pascal pointed out in the 17th century, we're completely insignificant physically. But he said, we are reeds, but we are thinking reeds. He said, un roseau pensant, a thinking reed. So we're all like that. I mean, we are vulnerable physically, but our thought and our intuition and our capacity to understand is what marks us out, or can do.
You write about love very eloquently, and especially in reference to the work of Swedenborg and also the Bulgarian mystic. I'm going to ask you to pronounce his name because I'm afraid I'll mispronounce it.
Well, he has his family name, which is Peter Deunov, and then his spiritual identity is Beinsa Duno. So it's quite similar. The Duno and the Deunov, or the Deunov, are similar. But the Beinsa Duno is the being, if you like, as I understand it, who spoke through the physical personality of Peter Deunov.
And both of these great prophetic figures wrote very eloquently about love, and which I think is so important. It's really central, I think, to your thinking and to mine as well. It's central to my name even. But I think that we live in an era in which to even talk about love, it gets debased. It's so trite that the word loses its power.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And what Deunov explained was there are different levels of love. There's a love level of personality, then there's the friendship, and then there's the third level, which is where it begins to take on more power, where he says love is a force in the mind. And by that he means that people who embody love in their lives, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, Albert Schweitzer, other people, and then they embody it in a way that it becomes visible, and they sacrifice themselves accordingly. And then the final level is what he calls love as a principle in the spirit, and this represents the harmonization of opposites, the bringing together of the light and the dark, and the as a fundamental principle. But what's important, I think, is also its context within what he explains as the pentagram. And so there are 5 principles which are love, wisdom, truth, justice, and goodness, or virtue. And they make up the pentagram. And this is also expressed in the sacred dance that he designed, which is called Paneurythmy. So the third part of the Paneurythmy is when you dance the actual shape of the pentagram. And so the love is associated with life, the wisdom with light, and the truth in combining love and wisdom in his understanding and in many other spiritual traditions, brings freedom. So truth is associated with freedom. And what's important for me about these principles is exactly that they are principles, they're not beliefs. And he said that everybody can believe in the importance of these principles and embodying them. You don't need to sign up to any kind of creedal belief system. You just need to try and understand these principles more and more deeply, the masculine and feminine also coming together, and then see how best to embody them. And he said, love is life for the whole. And so it's devoting yourself to these principles. So I think we need a new discourse and understanding about love. Next week, I'll be doing a book briefing on the new book called Radical Loving by Rabbi Wayne Dozick. And then last year I did an interview with Michael Lerner on his book Revolutionary Love. And so I think it's beginning to come forward, and we need to have this conversation about how to enact love at this deep level. Gandhi was obviously doing the same thing, because it has to be done non-violently, and how to address a world that actually is run on militaristic lines through force and violence. And what Deunov also explains is that there are these different degrees of 4 degrees of human culture, and so there is violence is as it were the lowest level, and then there is justice and sort of violence and force. Then there's a justice, and then it moves into love as the sublime principle, and which he insists is the direction of our evolution. And Barbara Marx Hubbard said something very similar. I've missed one out, but you get the idea.
Well, I'm impressed by the fact that you were so moved when you first encountered the work of Peter Deunov that you actually took the time and the trouble to learn the Bulgarian language so that you could read his works directly.
Yes, I did. And it so happened that there was a Bulgarian woman living in my local village who used to go to the Women's Institute market on the Thursday morning. And so I spent 18 months, twice a week having lessons with her with a fat Bulgarian grammar. And I am a linguist, but I'd never learned Russian, and so I didn't know the script. And so you have to kind of rewire your brain to recognize shapes in a different way. And that was very, very rewarding, because, as you know, I mean, just give a trivial example of the difference of language and connotation. If you take the word bread in English or American, that it conjures up, a certain shape of loaf. But if you say pain in French, that immediately conjures up something else, which is a long, thin stick of a baguette. Well, there's a lot more variety of bread actually in France now than there used to be. So you have Bulgarian for love is ljubov, and wisdom is mudrost, and the svoboda is freedom. And so these have quite different resonances, if you like. And one of the things that happens in the mountains is that people will form stones into these messages. And so you'll read a message on the ground which says Bog est ljubov, God is love. And so it's kind of arresting to arrange the natural elements into these messages.
David Lorimer, this has been a stimulating conversation, to put it mildly, and I know we've just scratched the surface of your vast wealth of knowledge and experience. I hope that I can arrange for you to come back on New Thinking Aloud often in the future. This has been a delightful conversation. I want to thank you so much for being with me.
Well, I'd love to, Jeff. And as you say, there's a myriad of things that we could talk about, but I think we have actually covered some very important points during our conversation.
Well, once again, thank you for being with me. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.